We briefly addressed coral reefs in the last mini lecture. Now let's look more at the importance of coral reefs and other ecological importance of poriferans and cnidarians. The first important thing to know is that while we can pretty much guess that coral reefs contain a lot of coral animals, they are also made of a lot of sponges too. We'll address that more on the next slide. Coral reefs are super important for many reasons. Ecologically, they hold a massive amount of biodiversity. Even though they make up less than 1% of the ocean by area, they hold an estimated 25% of the species that live in the ocean. Coral reefs are used by researchers to find new pharmaceuticals. It's similar to a rainforest on land. It holds a ton of biodiversity, and many of those organisms produce compounds that can be used as medicines. Coral reefs are also extremely important in protecting our coastlines, especially when large storms like hurricanes or cyclones come through. They slow or stop dangerous waves. This is becoming even more important every year because more and more dangerous storms are hitting our coasts. And as human populations increase, these coasts have more and more people living there. So the reefs are directly important in saving human lives. Indirectly, they also help humans for jobs and resources. It's estimated that $100 to $300 billion per year of the global economy comes directly from coral reefs. That's a nice chunk of change. And in the U.S., half of the fish used by fisheries spend at least some stage of their lives relying upon coral reefs. While we call them coral reefs, sponges are actually super important. Remember that sponges pull in massive amounts of water. They eat the bacteria and microbes inside and use that carbon and other nutrients to grow their bodies. So basically, they're pulling in and concentrating all these resources. While they're alive, the sponges serve as a habitat or homes for many other species of animals. All the pores and the central cavity of the sponge are great places for other animals to live in or hide. When a sponge dies, they slowly decay and release all that carbon and all those nutrients. Their bodies become a source of these nutrients. It's thought that there would actually be no coral reefs without sponges as a source of nutrients. I'm introducing these terms, source and sink, even though we've already addressed the concepts in many ways. When we talk about a species range, there's often a good habitat that individuals will reproduce a lot in, and from there, they spread out into poorer habitats. In biogeography, we talked about populations moving from a mainland, the source, out across an ocean, a sink, with a small chance that they might reach an island. In the next unit, we'll talk about sources and sinks of sugars produced by photosynthesis. Getting back to the importance of coral reefs, 2/3 of all coral reefs on the planet are threatened. We've lost about 50% of coral reefs since the 1950s and about 14% in just the past 10 years. So the loss rate is speeding up. There are two major ways we're losing coral reefs. These first three all relate to climate change. The first two are the most important. Remember that the color of corals is due to their zooxanthellae. Coral animals are clear, and their skeletons, like our bones, are white. But the photosynthetic zooxanthellae have pigments. In this coral, the zooxanthellae are a nice bright orange. Think for a minute about how you feel when you get way too hot. Sometimes you're like, I'm so hot, I'm going to throw up. And that's what these corals do. They get so hot that they spit out their zooxanthellae. The coral loses its color. This is called coral bleaching. When this happens, the corals are still alive, at least for a little while. If the water cools back down, the coral can pull their zooxanthellae back in and get the color back. But while corals can still feed, the zooxanthellae provides most of their food for them, like 85%. So if the corals go too long without their zooxanthellae, they'll die. We didn't see the first incidents of coral bleaching until 1998. While that may be before you were born, it's not really that long ago. Oceans are getting hotter, and many coral reefs are dying as a result. There's also the problem of ocean acidification. When you have carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it can diffuse into the water. A chemical reaction occurs in the water that results in more acidity. The more carbon dioxide in the water, the more acidic the water becomes. For corals, this exoskeleton is made of calcium carbonate. It's a base. So if you put the acid and the base together, they neutralize each other and the calcium carbonate reef will bubble away. While coral bleaching may kill the polyps, acids destroy the remains of the reef. The whole coral reef is just gone. So these are the biggest factors impacting coral reefs. Another one related to climate change is sea level rise. Since coral have these photosynthetic zooxanthellae, they need to be in the photic zone of the ocean. They need light. If the sea level rises, though, the corals will be deeper in the water where there's less light, so they can starve to death. And then there's all these other threats to corals, too. Remember eutrophication? That's where you have a fertilizer or sewage runoff into the water, and those nutrients cause an algae bloom. Algae tend to float at the top of the water where the light is. If there's an algae bloom on the surface of the water, it'll shade the coral underneath, and they can't get enough light. Sediment from construction projects or erosion can run off into the water, and the sediment settles down to the ocean floor. But if there's coral there, the sediment can settle onto the coral, blocking the light. There are pollutants released into water, especially around human populations. And because humans depend so much on coral reefs, we tend to live near them. Humans also tend to wear sunscreen. And if we go into the water, that sunscreen, a chemical pollutant, can affect the coral animals. Many locations like Hawaii or at the Great Barrier Reef request that people not wear sunscreen in the water because those chemicals are toxic to these animals. There's destructive fishing and mining. This graphic shows a type of fishing trawl that drags along the bottom of the ocean. It can destroy sponges, which coral reefs depend upon. Mining companies are starting to mine in deep sea regions. They just dredge up the entire sea floor, remove the minerals they want, then release the sediment back into the water, destroying and breaking apart coral reefs. There can be a problem with tourism too. If you go with a reputable company, they give you information on how to avoid touching the reef while you're snorkeling or diving, but not all companies do this. And now there's a new disease that can strike in literally a month and kill huge swaths of coral. In most cases, if the corals are healthy, they can fight off this disease. But corals with all these threats can't, and the disease is becoming more deadly. So how do we save the coral reefs? Well, there are some ideas. First, if you have a managed area with a healthy protected reef, it can serve as a source to replenish any nearby damaged corals. This is a picture of a healthy group of corals. They're releasing their gametes into the water. The eggs and sperm meet up and new little babies can form. These are a lot of baby corals. So happy, healthy, prolific corals can make many new corals. Some biologists in aquaria or zoos are hand-raising corals to spawn them intentionally so they can grow. And then they plant these little patches of coral back in the ocean. These solutions sound great, except it's the same problem we've seen with endangered species on land. Animals can reproduce on their own. They're very good at it. Their reproduction is not the problem. The problem is that we're destroying the corals that already exist, and it takes thousands to millions of years to make a coral reef. We really need to focus on saving what's already there. Of course, there's this whole big list of threats we just covered that negatively impact coral reefs. Just like we saw in the environmental issues lectures, this long list of problems just seems overwhelming to address each one. Or, just like other environmental issues, we can recognize that all these problems have one thing in common: our cultural attitude that we want more, 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 and we want it without consequence or responsibility. We need to change our culture, and that starts with each person, each choice.